Welcome to week 4 of pop culture. And as we look at this week, we're going to study interaction theory and use fashion as the backdrop for that. I want to again remind you of my contacts. I continue to do that throughout. And as we get closer to the last week, you might have more questions about the final project. And again, I am going to continue to try to help you out with the essay questions and any kind of thing that you need to prepare, because I just want to see your final output look the best it possibly can. So again, these are my contact numbers and emails. All right, so this week, you are reading Erving Goffman's Presentation of Self. It's just a simple introduction chapter, but it presents most of the concepts that Goffman has presented as far as how we present ourselves and how we are people who gain our own self-image from looking at others and recognizing that we try things on. So I love this quote from Erving Goffman: "Choose your self-presentations carefully, for what starts out as a mask may become your face," meaning you've tried on something enough that people have perceived that. And I don't know if any of you have had that problem in your interactions with people you've known from the past who remember you. Maybe you were a star baseball player, or maybe you were a person who sang really well in some sort of an organization or in school, or had a role in a play or something like that. Especially people that are older with you will often categorize you into that label. And in that label, they perceive who you are going to be. And that's part of this, is that as we grow older, and as we've talked about, as you have been socialized over time and developed your own taste, that sometimes that will go up and against how people maybe socialized you, or maybe you had perceptions of them even that are different, and you're doing the same thing to them. You may remember your favorite teacher looking old, but find out that actually they were 35 or something like that. So we are always choosing self-presentations, and sometimes if we do that so much, people will continually go back to that. This is all in symbolic interactionism, which is a micro-level theory. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but micro-level theories tend to focus more in a smaller group setting, and this theory focuses on the relationships of individuals with society as they make society. And communication is the way we do that, whether we're communicating verbally, whether we are communicating with our votes, as we talked about earlier, whether we're communicating what we want people to see based on how we dress, what our facial expressions are, how we are communicating maybe our interests in other people, and especially, if we're communicating some sort of attraction and how that attraction plays out. It's believed to be the way in which people make sense of their social worlds. And the only way we do that is with a bunch of other people. And we can't really escape that because we are born into families, groups, communities, and those experiences of the places we've grown up in have often embedded themselves to a point where when we get out into the world and start influencing the world as adults, that we may be changing society around us as well. Now, even though we're studying Erving Goffman this week, the person that really started this whole idea of this theory was George Herbert Mead. He studied human development, a lot of social psychology, especially the development as children into maturity and then into adulthood. And watching those stages, how children get their cues about their gender, how they get their cues about their culture, and how they get their cues about what it means to grow up as an adult human. And so we will credit a lot to George Herbert Mead. And in education, you might study him more thoroughly if you're an education major because of that child development. But Goffman is often one who keeps going with that, saying, we constantly do this sense of checking ourselves and seeing how we, buy into popular culture and buy into basically the world around us. And so we want to make sure to lift up that Goffman is not the founding theorist, but that a lot of what we're looking at this week applies to both of these theorists. So remember in the first weekend I said the first thing we have to recognize is that we all play a part in what is popular. That's still true, and most importantly, this particular theory has a clear connection with this thought. We all shape society, and we all have society shape us, but especially so when we look at the micro world of our social groups, as we look at our systems that we've been embedded with, and also as we look at networks and the types of people we interact, especially online and those kind of areas, how people perceive you based on a post or based on how they see your interests being displayed. And so we are part of that context. So interaction theory looks more closely at your role in developing society through your interactions. And the last 2 weeks, we've really been looking at what we call macro theory. When you look at functionalism, it's trying to see the larger function, even though it can look at things like the function of a family and it can look at functions of communities. It typically tries to expand on that theory and often comes at it from a world perspective. And then as we overlay function onto societies to see how that looks. The same is true about conflict theory. You often may not be able to see at micro levels some of the mass issues that are going on. So maybe you may not have crime in your area, or you may not have a sense of experiencing racism or discrimination at a particular level. But when you add up in conflict theory the mass amount of people that are experiencing certain things, then you kind of see that at a macro level. This week, interaction creates a sense of the micro theory, how you are in this world that's right in front of you. And it gives you an idea of the decisions and the influence that you might have, let's say on a younger generation that are looking at you. Let's say you have cousins that are kind of enamored with who you are as a person. That little interaction changes that person, and they set their pattern of what they think is popular, how they dress, the choices they make, the political parties they associate with, the types of groups that they would associate with, maybe even jobs, those types of things. So that's what we're looking at this week. So I'm going to give you an example, and I want you to think of a person that might be like this for you. I was a suburban kid. I was south of Wichita in a town called Derby, and my mom got me 17 magazine when I was probably 10, and I devoured that magazine. And we were in a big enough community that the high school was fairly large, and we were close enough to shopping malls because I was a shopping mall kid, and I would look at those fashions. But believe me, in the 80s, I wasn't sure, as a lot of people look back on that fashion in the 80s, you're like, okay, I'm going to be wearing neon tights, all these rubber bangles and stuff in a community that's still in the state of Kansas. And so I wasn't sure how that would present. However, Tiffany Angel, yes, that's the name of a real person, was the most popular homecoming queen person in Derby. I remember when her fashion switched, and I kept an eye on, as did most of the women in school or young girls in school, at what Tiffany wore. And I will never forget the day that she wore these striped tights and her hair kind of in the side, kind of ponytail. Just think completely Stranger Things fashion, 100%, just was pulling it off. And I just was enamored. And this fashion statement wasn't necessarily something that I would have felt comfortable with, but it started to work on my brain because I really wanted to try this on. I wanted to see what that personality of the 80s and being an 80s girl was all about. So in a week or two, I had gone out and bought an outfit. It was neon pink with floral mini skirt that had suspenders, pink tights, and jelly shoes. Did the big hair. I felt so self-conscious. That's part of trying on popular culture, is that there's a sense of fun, but also a sense of absolute fear. How are people going to judge me? So I went to school. I felt great, and I also felt all the time eyes looking at me because my personal self had been a little experimental. I had worn neon shirts, some ripped jeans, that kind of thing, but I'd never gone all out with the whole pink thing, completely floral. And I will never forget this other girl coming up to me and saying, "My boyfriend thinks that is the craziest outfit. I can't, he would never want me to wear it. I think it's amazing. I think you're rocking it." I felt an entire tinge of exactly a sense of success that I could pull this off. And never again would I ever have to go through that phase again of somebody seeing me in that outfit. I may have to feel, self-conscious a couple times. What was interesting is I wasn't really interested in what the boys were thinking. I was really interested in the network of girls. That was a sense of popularity. I wasn't really a person that wanted to be popular, but I wanted myself of self-expression through my body, through my image, to not be something that was just, forgotten about or not tried on. And so I did it, and I was never Tiffany Angel. And I always look back and give thanks that I at least tried that. But this is part of that process we're talking about with interaction. If I hadn't been watching her and then brave enough to go ahead and try where other girls were probably trying to think, should I try that on or not? They, probably would go back themselves and say, I didn't do that. Maybe I should have. There's that kind of expression of, it just kind of missed that window of opportunity. So I can say with definity that I did the 80s thing to a certain level and extent. Would I wear it today? Absolutely not. So that means the power of personal influence plays a big role in this, because a whole school, which by the way, Derby was about 1,500 students, was influenced by this one person. And also, as I interacted with what I was seeing, the person that I'm comparing myself, not necessarily the stranger, but more a person who appealed to me based on their fashion taste and trying to take a risk and also look like, and this is the most important part, look like the popular culture at the time as it was presented through MTV, presented through our icons. I remember the guys when they would try out, it wasn't just a female thing. The guys tried out the Andre Agassi hair. They tried out the whole, mullet. And that took some bravery on the first people that did mullets. They tried on the sense of, the lover boy t-shirts cut to the side and just, a sense of the Converse tees and the way you wore stuff. So it wasn't just a gendered expression, although there was clear gender roles as Mead would have looked at from, if a boy showed up in a pink floral mini skirt at that time in that age, there would have been some clear labeling. And the same true for females, even though male dressing was okay, it was very boyfriend looky. And so you have to look at these interactions. What were the fashions that you in your high school, who was the Tiffany Angel? Who was the person that absolutely made an impact? Maybe you were the Tiffany Angel. I don't know. The other thing is her very name this is something Grazian brings up, was popular. She had a name that was of the time. And I had a name, Jan. Jan was already old by the time I got to school. My parents named me this name that was a totally 60s name. And I feel like the only Jans that I know are about 25 years older than me. So it's so funny how you don't think about those things in the moment, but I think I was trying to give myself, even though my name was old-fashioned, a sense of that freshness, a sense of being part of the popular culture. And that's just a self reflection on my own world. Maybe you were in the rural culture and you knew the part of who wore a particular type of roper, or, those ropers were a certain color. Maybe you drove a certain car. The fashion is not just about that presentation of what is on your body, but your body in the present moment of the clothing, what you're driving, who you're hanging out with. It's almost like it is all part of something that you wear, and that makes an impression. And we base this all on our social encounters. We only make these things typically happen in our brain when we're in the presence of others or reflecting on our presence, as if we're going to be in the presence of others, or reflecting on ourselves as we have been. And so it's this very intricate place in our brains where that meeting between two or more people in a situation that's either face to face, and also in this day and age, that includes the internet. How are you going to present, for example, your avatar? I think this is a fascinating world of study. If anybody in sociology wanted to study this more, I think it would be a really great dissertation. I think a lot of people are working in this area, but you may be a person that's a total gamer and say, I am not presenting myself face to face. Well, is that true? If you're playing an interactive game, is your character female or male or unidentifiable because they have a gender spectrum that, maybe changes, or is gender fluid? Is it a troll or is it a fairy? Is it a person who works with magic, or is it, some person that is basically a strong warrior? That is a presentation of yourself. And you're doing this thing called impression management. Even if you're online, you're trying to impress a group of people to buy into your character. And you're preparing for the presentation of that social role by picking the character and, setting up. I was into Diablo for a really long time. And so we didn't have a lot of choices, but I always liked the sense that I could present myself in that particular way, even though it may not look like me at all. This is also something that then when we play act, a lot of times we take that and it bleeds out into society. We're seeing that more and more. For example, the early stages of this, when rock and roll started to come around, we started to see, people looking at the Beatles or looking at the Rolling Stones and starting to put on the wear that looked like that. Or if you're a skateboarder, putting on the wear of a skateboarder. Now there are so many venues. We might talk about this at the end a little bit too. Is popular culture, in this vacuum anymore? And it may have expanded so much because we have so much access to different groups. But no matter what the group is, you're still doing impression management. You're preparing for the presentation of yourself, whether you are with your friends, whether you are trying to be in your coworker, their space and try to impress a coworker or a boss, or whether you're online. All things are basically a role, and everybody's doing this. Not a single person isn't trying to make an impression based on what they wear. So that makes it almost kind of an art of yourself. And there's a simplicity sometimes to that art that might be cultural. I almost even consider it folk a little bit based on the culture of who you are. But sometimes it can be very avant-garde. It can be very, outside of the box. So let's say I looked at in high school, not at Tiffany Angel, who was wearing a very popular culture outfit that, yes, was on the edge. But what if I looked at the person who did decide to cross-dress or do something where they were wearing a furry costume or something like that, and that's what the impression was. So we are constantly looking and for some reason having some attraction to another, and maybe judging for ourselves, do we want to participate in that? And therefore, you're presenting a social self, how individuals build your self-image from the judgment of others. And you have maybe talked a lot about how you don't do that, but in some ways you might have done that. If you dated a person and they wanted you in Levi's jeans, that's a social self-judgment, that you might want to impress that person because you're wearing Levi's jeans. And you might even say, well, you have to just deal with what I'm wearing, t-shirts and, sandals. That's still a statement of your social self. And if enough people do that, it might actually be popular. It looks normal. It may even look normalized to you, but that social self has a sense of, creeping in there and seeing as you change. And over time, this is another thing we don't talk about, is as you age, you might age out of certain things and into others. And it might be because your body changes. It might be because you are holding a particular kind of job, that doesn't allow you to present your social self in quite the same way that you did in early age. So you're always doing things where you're presenting yourself and you strategically embody that based on each group. Now we're going to look at this too. So think about how you present yourself when you're with grandparents. And you may dress exactly how you do every day, but your language may change. Let's say your grandparents are particularly religious and you try to watch your language in the presence of them. Maybe you don't. Maybe you want to be a rebel and be up and against them. Again, you're presenting yourself. You can't get away from the presentation of it. You just are making a choice about how that social self will be perceived. Impression management is difficult to kind of recognize until you step in and out of different groups. So this week, you might allow yourself to see, okay, how do I act when I'm working versus if I'm gaming versus if I'm listening to certain kinds of music? Am I wearing particular types of clothing? When you go to school, for example, face-to-face, in college, you're probably not going to wear a lot of the things that you wear when you're doing online, because you might be like completely in your pajamas or whatever, and it doesn't matter. Your presentation of self is all about your brain and what you're writing and contributing there. But if you wore that same thing into class, you probably wouldn't do that. So that's all how social interaction works. And by the way, it's popular for people taking online classes to say, oh, I can do this in my pajamas. So if you studied as an aggregate, people who do online, how many of them are in their pajamas while they're doing that? It's actually probably a little bit of a pop piece that would be kind of fun. The other thing, not a lot of people date in college the same way. You know, I grew up kind of in the dating generation, but people often wait to date, but we all probably will go or have gone on some sort of a date, whether it be one for romantic purposes or one that's, you know, just with a date with friends and going out. These are the questions that interactionists would ask. You know, what do you wear? How are you navigating what you're trying to present? And if you go to a particular kind of club, let's say you're going out with friends, you're not even trying to impress one person. You're trying to impress an entire group, maybe your friends and also people you don't know. Is the club something that you'd wear boots to go to? And if you showed up in a mini skirt and some sort of, you know, hot pop or rave outfit, you might be ostracized. How do you fit into the place you're going? And that determines what you wear. The other thing is that you've paid attention to what people wear at these things. For example, in college, we had 2 locations out of Winfield that we would go. I was in a very small college, and we would go either south to Wichita, which meant you would dress in kind of the 90s latex, and you would go to the bars that, you know, the lights were half the show, and you know, they had really, really long dance tracks that just lasted forever and you just went crazy. But then if you went we went north to Wichita, and then south to Oklahoma, we'd go across the border to this bar that was outside of, I think, Ponca City or something like that. And it was a total Mickey Gillies kind of place. Totally put on your plaid. You still might do a mini skirt, but it's a denim. You'd put on your boots, and you didn't typically have songs that went on with lots of lights. Instead, you did things like line dancing and that type of thing. So what you wear based on the culture you're trying to impress and the people that you're trying to impress is part of that. Who are you trying to impress? Again, this goes back to an interesting question. A lot of times people say, oh, I'm trying to impress the person I'm going with. If you're on a single date, is that true? Are you really trying to impress the whole group so that a group recognizes and gives you that kind of good feeling about how you dressed? Are you not trying to impress anybody? That is an interesting thing. You may choose to counter it with I'm not going to fall into this category, but I'm just going to go as myself. Still, there's an impression there. You are making an impression about who you are. Where do you go? Again, if you're going on a date, is there a difference if you're going to a movie where you're going to be in a place for a while that you're not even going to see each other's outfits, or if you're going to a movie and dinner, and therefore you have a little bit of a different change. And how do you present yourself and your tastes? Again, maybe you're going to something and you don't really like it, so you might even say something along the way of, I'm going to this, but I just want to impress you because I know you like it, or I'm with a group because they like it, but I'm not necessarily in it because of my taste. I really like something different. All of this is part of that impression management. And therefore, where this plays a role in pop culture is that, the production of popular culture may be centralized, and this is from David Grazian's book, and it's his quote, among music labels, film studios, television networks, streaming content providers, and media conglomerates. That's kind of that macro level of influence that we are looking at in society. However, if that doesn't fly at the micro level, the interactions of your friends and your social scenes, and a scene is where, people go, for example, if it's a rave and somebody has a DJ that has been promoted to come in, do this stuff, and they are just too popular. Sometimes rave will sometimes bounce back and say, no, I think the local DJ is a lot better. That can be a total bomb, and that means that pop culture is affected, and that presence and that icon. And all of that is by that social network and that context of your everyday life making an impression on society. It's not just the impression of your group, but it's, if you as a group don't buy into it, and there's more and more groups that tend to do that, you are playing a part. And again, this is where we see sometimes where subcultures eventually become the pop culture, because the pop culture tends to have a sense of capitalism and capitalist practice, trying to gain the most votes, therefore the most dollars, therefore the most jobs, and therefore the most power. It may be something that they may put all their efforts into, but if they have not paid attention to the micro level, it won't work. And that's a real important point when we're studying this theory. So therefore, your social networks consist of these individuals. Oh, I spelled that wrong, so I'll try to change that before I upload it. Connected to one another through a variety of relationships. And your social networks, I want you to maybe make a list of all of them if you can. Try to think about how you play those out in the post this week. The strength and weakness of the networks that you're playing a part of. For example, my social network at Emporia State tends to be with students, but it depends on how well I know a student about the strength and the weakness of that. But I also am interacting with faculty, which I have a stronger connection to because I'm working with colleagues every day. However, I don't know many of the people over in Plum. I'm not over there very often. So those are the kinds of things you can think about, your networks of, the classrooms, the places that you connect with people. But who do you work with? How's that a social network? Who are your friends? Where are the places you go hang out? Is there a social network that you hang out with online? Are there people that know who you are, that you're part of groups? Who are the social networks that are part of your family? All of this is based on weakness and strength, and your interaction with them is going to have more influence if it's a stronger tie and less influence if it's weaker. The other piece that comes into this play is social networks provide the key to understanding how everyday pop culture trends, fads, and fashions go, into full swing. So you look at ripped jeans, and I've had my husband and I have talked about this. I grew up in a culture of ripped jeans, and he's like, I just never got into it. And yet the jeans are, they're different levels of ripping. There's some that barely hold on, and then there's tons of variations of the color and the style. How do you determine if you're going to wear ripped jeans, which kind, where you're going to get them? And you typically look at your friends. You either want to be the fashion forward person, which talk about that in a bit, or you might want to just blend in. Maybe they're all wearing ripped jeans, and so you're kind of wanting to try that out too. Oversized sunglasses, yoga pants. Oh my gosh, the athletic wear, athleisure wear is just everywhere. I mean, I can't have a classroom. They're comfortable. People feel good in them. guys and their bomber jackets or their tennis shoes or again, boots, all of these things become popular because you do vote for it, but it's also a major influence on your social network, whether you buy into it or not. And if you don't buy into it, for example, there may be something sent out there. We do this all the time with movies where some people think, oh my gosh, Men in Black 3 is going to go off with no hitch. And then people watch it and they get online and they're like in their aggregates, deciding together whether or not it's worth going. And that network makes a big impact on the movie and its sales. Whereas other, types of movies might, not be liked by the critics. They didn't have a lot invested in them. A while back, there were a couple sleepers. Why am I Pedro for president? I'm forgetting that most important movie that was. I don't know why I'm forgetting it. Anyway, you might know what movie I'm talking about based on Pedro for president, but you might be saying it right now and going, but there's times where a sleeper movie will kind of not be something that people have talked much about, but because, on the big macro level, but yet those locals, those networks love it, and it does extremely well at the box office. So that's something to keep in mind. And then therefore, similar to influencers that we talked about last week, there's a critical group that can influence society. And a lot of times that's online. But there's also a sense of connectors. And of course, these are the Kardashians. I couldn't have told you. I didn't know who they were. I still don't pay attention to them. But they connect this huge bridge, particularly large numbers of discrete and insular networks, meaning they're connected to basically stars and the elite in Hollywood, but then, of course, married to music stars and or basketball players. They're involved with all kinds of fashion networks. And these are connectors. They're not just influencing one market. They are connecting those markets. In fact, I bought a pair of some of my favorite sunglasses that I ever bought. And I saw the side of it and it was like K something. And I was checking out and they said, oh yeah, it's a Kardashian brand. And I almost put it back, but it was like, I love them. So I think that that's an interesting thing. It just bleeds over when you're seeing connectors, they're doing that. There's also another group called the early adopters, sorry, not adapters. This can happen both at the large level, the macro level, and in your own group. So think about people in your own group who was the first person to maybe get that awesome Chevy truck, this straight black looking massive thing. And you start to covet it. You start to want it. And you may not want to want it. Or maybe you're a Ford driver, so this doesn't do anything for you. But there's a sense of, I want that product. This whole VR thing, my husband and I have a VR. It was given, as a Christmas present that a group kind of all of us went on for Mitch. But everybody seemed to have a VR as a dream present that were in our family. Did I really want a VR? I don't know. It wasn't my big deal. But here is that first person that adopted it, which was Mitch's brother. You fill in who is the one that, they were like, we could do VR experiences together. Newest phone, Apple, version. Who has bought that? Who bought the very first Apple phone? If you're old enough for that, I remember a person, Eduardo Bassan, bought an Apple phone, and my husband forever and ever was turned to Apple products like that. And so early adopters are important in the social network because you're often paying attention to them. And going back to the Tiffany Angel story, she was an early adopter at our high school for a particular fashion that would soon take over. By the way, I started wearing it and other people started wearing clothes like that, and it didn't feel so weird after a while because guess what? It became popular culture and it was popular culture enough that we didn't feel like idiots. Now, go back and look at some pictures. There may be some contention for that. So this then is the interesting phrase that we make fun of. Keeping Up with the Kardashians, of course, was the title of a show based on this very phrase, Keeping Up with the Joneses. Fun fact, I lived right next door to some Joneses. So keeping up with the Joneses is kind of the idea behind interaction theory in a lot of ways. How we impress and make impressions is based on that constant, obsolescence that we were talking about last lecture, where things go out of fashion and other things come into fashion. And you may not think that you are keeping up with the Joneses until you do a job interview and you realize that your closet is not up to date. It doesn't look fashion forward enough for the position that maybe you're looking for. So you might go buy a new tie because the other tie is too thin or too narrow. You might go buy a new blouse because the blouse looks like it was produced 5 years ago. And you want to present that fresh expression of yourself. So keeping up with the Joneses isn't maybe something you do every single day on a conscious level, but when you see places that you want to make an impression and a particular kind of impression, that's when you will go back into this interaction theory and say, okay, I'm going to interact with other people. This is how I want to present myself. I have to pay attention to the popular culture at the time so that I fit in and I look at least, maybe even a little more cutting edge, so that they think I'm something that will be more fresh for the next generation. This is true of any products that we get into. So what does it signify about interactions and what becomes popular? That it plays a big, huge role in the long run in your everyday life, and that you are paying attention to it. Question for this week then is, how do your interactions with others both influence the idea of your identity and vice versa? How are you seeing yourself in the judgment of others on you as it's placed upon you, and how in also the same fashion are you presenting yourself, that it may change their minds. You're part of social groups and networks where you present your social self and navigate your impressions. So this is what can be said this week about interaction theory and fashion. It's typically a micro theory, so you have to pay attention to your group. It's a power of social influence and social encounters that interact with each other. And eventually, fashion can often look high fashion based on being elite and maybe something inaccessible that you would never try. It can also be a fashion that you have encountered people going ahead and trying on, and therefore you may be challenged to try or buy into it. And or you might be a person that it hasn't influenced you enough. Your ties are not strong enough with the group that is presenting that particular fashion, and so you don't buy into it, but that also then affects the market as a whole. You present yourself to others through impression management, as do others to you. You're always trying to impress each other. It's not the sense of impression that we talk about like, oh, I just don't want to impress anybody. You are making an impression no matter what. Everybody's sizing each other up. Doesn't mean that they're judging in a negative sense or even trying to make you feel bad in that judgment. It's just what humans do. We judge each other in a way that gives us a sense of our self-identity, our comfort level up and against somebody else's. Social networks connect people to fashion and fads. The only way you really get into wanting something typically is because somebody else has wanted it, and it might connect you into a group. So for example, if again going on to online gaming, there may be a particular weapon that you have that somebody is coveting because it is rare and very difficult to find. But if you really think about it, it's not a physical thing, but it still has physical power in that sense of people being impressed by that. And then early adopters and connectors help us to see if we're part of that connection system, and we know the early adopters and they've bought into something. It helps us test our participation in the fashion. Do we want to go ahead and participate in that or not? So this week, think in those micro terms. Also, if you're looking at this for your particular social theory, to look at for your final project, you might consider, looking at a particular group and how they may feel like their interactions are not necessarily buying into the fashion, but maybe trying to counteract but at the same time, that makes an impression and does change popular culture in not participating. So we get to the end of the three theories being presented. Which of these theories do you plan to apply to your final project? By now in this section of the course, you should at least have a group that you're picking to focus on and look at their music, look at their fashion, look at their sense of what they would look at for movies or TV, and the ways again and how that flows back and forth in their lives. What are the strengths and weaknesses of all three theories when applied to the study of popular culture? Does critical theory do a better job of really telling us what's going on, or is it something that interaction does better, or really is functionalism something that basically takes care of the majority? You pick. Is popular culture as popular in a global world of networks and continual subculture? And this is maybe the biggest question. How have we kind of gone beyond the idea of one pop culture idea? And is pop culture something, obviously, that is in a global nature, very regional? It tends to have an American stance to it in how people have studied it in the past. But what are the types of things? How's K-pop, for example, and J-pop coming into the world? Or how do people who pay attention to the European scene embed that in the United States? These are things that are constantly being asked by the sociological world and the mind and the imagination. And I invite you to consider that. So we put it all together next week, and then we start to really focus on the end of this course. Again, remember to post, have fun, respond to your classmates, respond to those classmates. It's 10 points. If you don't respond, you don't get as high of a grade in this particular section, which I believe is about 15 to 20%. I can't remember, but I want to make sure that you get the best grade you can. Contact me if you need anything. Otherwise, have a great week.